Hello, Tony Hines here. You're listening to the Chain Reaction Podcast, all about supply chain advantage. This is the news roundup, all things impacting global supply chains this week. So stick around, stay tuned, find out more. In the news this week, more tariffs on China from the United States, Tesla's woes with regard to the EV rollout and the dismantling of the whole Tesla charging team, and the pressure that's putting on US policy, inflation rates, climate change, and many other things coming your way in the next 25 minutes.
Chain Reaction.
Well, President Joe Biden has introduced tariffs on China's electric vehicles, solar, and medical supplies. And this is all part of the continuing saga to put restrictions on China's imports. The new tariffs will be in place as soon as next week. It will entail continuing with the tariffs put in place on many Chinese goods by the former President Donald Trump. But there are also new tariffs on semiconductors and solar equipment, and there'll be tariffs on medical supplies like syringes and personal protection equipment. This is Section 301, tariffs. The Biden administration said they focused on strategic, competitive, and national security areas. Many want tariffs on Chinese vehicles, and that's to protect the home market. These are continuing protective measures. The tariffs on Chinese EVs are about to go up by 4 times under the new Biden administration plan, according to the Wall Street Journal. And there continue to be risks about China's EVs having tech on board, which could pose a risk to America's population by obtaining personal data. These recommendations were made by the US Trade Representative's office in the past few weeks. This is all coming as the serious election agendas begin to be established for the November presidential vote. Trump has said he wants to see 60% or higher tariffs on all Chinese goods. There's no doubt going to be retaliation from China, of course, and it just heightens the tension between these two largest economies in global trade. Between 2017 and 2021, Trump introduced a number of tariffs which started the trade war with China. So free trade is not on the table at the moment. Both of the candidates for the presidency have said that they intend to protect the home market and reduce China's impact. Chinese metal products were targeted products too, within a narrow range, and it's estimated that more than $1 billion of steel and aluminium products have been impacted. There's also an investigation into Chinese trade practices across shipbuilding, maritime, and logistics sectors, and that could mean even more tariffs. The Biden administration has also been pressuring Mexico to prohibit China from selling its metal products to the United States indirectly from that country. China have said that the tariff measures will be counterproductive and they'll inflict harm on global trade and the US. Now, is China itself suffering from a bout of inflation? Well, that appears to be the case. It was reported this week that China's consumer prices have risen for a third straight month in April, and the producer prices have experienced continuing declines. So some tricky times ahead for Beijing. There have been a flurry of policy measures over the past few months. Consumer prices have gone up by 0.3% in April from the year earlier, according to the National Bureau of Statistics, and that's a rise of about 0.1% in March. And if we strip out food and energy prices, the data suggests a comeback in demand, especially for services. That's according to Zhu Jianxian, senior economist at the Economist Intelligence Unit. Core inflation, excluding food and fuel prices, which are more volatile, grew at around 0.7% in April, up from 0.6% in March. And the overall consumer price index rose by 0.1% from previous months. There have been price hikes by utility companies, which is also a driver. Municipal debt is said to be about $13 trillion. This data suggests that domestic demand is recovering, but it's a slow process. Consumer prices remain low and industrial manufacturing is still under pressure. The producer price index dropped to 2.5% in April from a year earlier. It was 2.8% in the previous month. The central bank said it would make monetary policy flexible. They wanted it to target particular sectors, and they wanted to be effective in their policy. The strategy to hold inflation down in consumer markets is key to economic recovery. The target for economic growth is about 5% in 2024, but many think it's going to be a challenge to achieve it. China's export growth has exceeded expectations, and it's demonstrating it's more resilient and is recovering from geopolitical uncertainties despite measures being taken against China by the United States. Exports rose 1.5% from a year earlier to $292.5 billion and there were 234 billion in April, compared to a 7.5% decline in March. Imports rose by 8.4% from a year earlier, and the China trade surplus stood at 72.4 billion, compared with 58.4 billion in March. Tesla has announced it's going to spend $500 million to expand its charging network. That was announced by Elon Musk on Friday. This, of course, comes on the tail of laying off all the employees that were running that business. So Tesla is going to spend $500 million expanding supercharged networks. It will create thousands of new jobs this year, Musk said in a post on social media platform X. And this comes, as we say, on the tail of the layoffs. Tesla's superchargers have tripled in the past 5 years. But if there's any slowdown in this, of course, it threatens Biden's policy for growth in the EV market. And of course, it will put pressure, even more so, on policymakers in the US to keep China EVs away from the home market while it sorts itself out. It was a strange decision, many think, to actually do away with the team that had been quite successful in expanding the EV charging stations around the country for Tesla, and they seem to have deals with other EV manufacturers, but seem to move away from that very quickly and have a turnabout in strategy. There's been a lot of state investment over the past few years by the Biden administration to get the EV charger network up and running, and Tesla's probably been quite a big beneficiary from that government investment. Elon Musk's decision to get rid of the whole EV team at Tesla will cause headaches for the Biden administration's program of electrification. Last year, they announced that they had ambitious plans to get the infrastructure in place so that they could drive up demand for EV adoption. This was under the National Electric Vehicles Infrastructure Program, and the government is giving out $5 billion to states over 5 years to build 500,000 EV chargers. Of course, if that money is invested and it goes to a network that then decides to pull out, that will be money wasted. So it's important to get this infrastructure market right. And Tesla's instability presently is a cause for concern because they have superchargers and they've been the biggest winner so far for those federal funds, which was a crucial part of the plan. But many are concerned now because of the layoffs to the Tesla team, and the partnerships in the programs that are already underway are also threatened. So they think that Tesla's going to pull out of the federal program, and that could cause a slowdown. And that's not what the government in the US want to happen. It will put it back to square one, of course. It will go right back to the start, and they'll have to rethink how they're going to develop the EV charging network through the country. Tesla had won awards to build 69 of the 501 NEVI-funded sites, but they're not going to move forward on those with the present disruption. Many think that the program's been pretty slow anyway to develop, and of course it will push back that market. Tesla have said they still intend to grow the EV charger installations, but it will be at a slower pace. Well, there have been protests against Tesla's German plant, and they've been quite serious. In Grünewald, near Berlin, protesters clashed with police, and they attempted to storm the Tesla facility on Friday. About 800 people took part in this protest, which was a group called Disrupt Tesla, which claims that the expansion of the Tesla plant would damage the environment. CEO Elon Musk had said that they didn't manage to break through into the plant. So this was an environmental protest. They're also concerned that it will impact countries like Argentina and Bolivia through lithium mining, and so they're very concerned about that. There were several arrests at the protest, and a few Tesla cars were damaged with paint spray and pyrotechnics at a nearby storage site. Tesla closed down the plant on Friday without giving any reason. There was another protest this week at the Barclays Bank AGM held in Glasgow, and that was by Extinction Rebellion, and that was all about investment in fossil fuel industries, trying to put pressure on Barclays to remove themselves from those sorts of investments. So it does seem that these protests are a growing problem, and we've known that for some time, and it's likely they're going to get worse, and they cause disruptions. Been a heat wave in Mexico this week, and the temperature in 10 cities, including Mexico City, peaked around 34.3 degrees Celsius. That's about 93.7 degrees Fahrenheit, and it's a tenth higher than the record, which was hit just a month earlier. Mexico's health ministry said that they have seen 7 heat-related deaths in this heat season between the start of March the 17th and May the 4th. And the tally could go even higher. And it's down to climate change and El Niño, which has been pushing up temperatures across the globe. There was an interesting court case this week. A federal appeals court on Friday dismissed a lawsuit by 4 Republican-led states, and they wanted to block a U.S. Securities and Exchange Commission rule that required investment funds to categorize and disclose proxy votes on issues including environmental, social, and governance matters, ESG. But the 3-judge panel at the New Orleans-based 5th U.S. Circuit Court Appeals said that Texas, Louisiana, Utah, and West Virginia lacked standing to challenge the rules, as they hadn't demonstrated how their citizens and the states would be harmed by the laws. So this was a piece of resistance back on having to disclose more information about environmental, social, and governance matters. They argued that the additional compliance costs would then be passed to fund investors, including the states. But the court said it was speculative, and there wasn't any clear evidence to support the claim. Of course, those states are claiming they would have been harmed because they've got oil and gas interests in Texas, and so it's a fight back from the fossil fuel lobby. The US auto safety regulator said on Friday it was opening preliminary investigations into complaints about diesel fuel leaks, allegedly from 200,000 Ford vehicles, the Ford F-250, 350, 450 and 550. Between 2015 and 2021. There was a fracture in the secondary fuel filter in the vehicles which could result in fire, and the NHTSA had contacted the maker of the filters, Alevard Segefi, USA, and learned that secondary fuel filters are tested to operate at reduced levels of pressure during the manufacturing process, compared with the possible maximum operating pressure experienced in the vehicle. Ford has said it's working with the NHTSA to cooperate with the investigation. It's a first inquiry to establish whether the vehicles pose an unreasonable risk to safety. Whether any action is taken will be for a later discussion. But the NHTSA has said that it's got significant safety concerns over Ford's recall of more than 42,000 SUVs, also related to fuel leaks and possible engine fires. Well, in the United Kingdom this week, there was some good news because apparently the economy grew by 0.6% between January and March, and that's the fastest growth rate in 2 years. The UK fell into recession at the end of last year, after shrinking for 2 quarters in a row. I'm always skeptical about this news kind of being promoted in an election year because it seems to be claimed by the party in power that they're responsible for this, when the truth of the matter is, it's a statistic. It's what happened. Did you do anything to achieve that? Not really. It's what happens in the market that presents the position. Interest rates are currently at the highest for 16 years. That means the borrowing rates are higher. Domestic borrowing for mortgages, people have to pay more. And of course, if you're a business, you have to pay more for the loans that you take on to invest in your business. And this week, the Bank of England held the interest rate at 5.25%. They said they expect inflation to fall further, and they're hoping that in the coming months, they'll be able to reduce the bank interest rate. The growth in the early part of the year is down to services, mainly in sectors such as hospitality, arts and entertainment. That's according to the Office of National Statistics. And there's also been an increase in consumer spending on things like clothing and home furnishings, but not sufficient to drive any inflation in that market, of course. But the good news is the economy is growing. Many people might not feel better off, but that's what the stats say. It was about the first quarter of 2022 when the growth rate hit about the same number. It was 0.6% in the first quarter of 24, and it was 0.5% back in the first quarter of 2022. But since then, it's been fairly flat, 0.1% positive and 0.1% negative. And of course, in quarter 3 and quarter 4 of 2023, we had a 0.1% fall and a 0.3% fall. Those are the Office of National Statistics figures. Of course, the economy will be a central plank of the elections that take place probably in the autumn of 2024. Well, another piece of interesting news that caught my attention this week was that for the first time ever, mosquitoes have been identified in Scotland. And for those of you listening out there that don't know, Scotland has a historically very cool climate. So to find mosquitoes in the Scottish countryside is a complete conundrum. So what does it mean? Well, it means, of course, that one of the most common types of mosquito identified in Scotland by the University of Glasgow has reached Scotland. They found apparently 16 types of mosquito in Scotland, including the Culex pipiens, which are prevalent in North and South America and parts of Europe, as well as in Asia and North Africa. Professor Heather Ferguson, who's been leading the study, said they were surprised to find these insects in all corners of the country. The warmer temperatures, of course, could lead to larger numbers of mosquitoes, which could transmit disease. So while we've all been to Scotland and experienced swarms of midges, which thrive in the warm and wet conditions in a Scottish summer, we're now going to have to fight off those mosquitoes too. Mosquitoes, of course, are larger than the midges and have a proboscis, which they suck blood. Lovely, isn't it? This means that mosquitoes are more feared across the world because they carry deadly diseases such as dengue fever, which I've mentioned previously in the past year, and Zika. 219 million people contract malaria from mosquitoes each year globally, and that causes about 400,000 deaths. They don't think that these particular types of mosquitoes that they've found in Scotland will be carrying malaria bugs anytime soon. So I think you can relax if you're planning a trip to Scotland. But it's interesting the impact of climate change, isn't it? And also, of course, travel. Because people bring back from their trips abroad, well, alien creatures to the local environment. Probably these mosquitoes have been around for some time, but they've been discovered recently. And there's now hard evidence to support that. So the Centre for Virus Research will be keeping a close eye on how the developments shape up. The highest concentration of mosquitoes in Scotland is around Loch Kinnordy in Angus and Brewster Leans in Caithness. That's according to the BBC. But with the warmer temperatures overall and global warming, we're probably likely to see some more. Another climate-related story that caught my eye this week was about Venezuela being the first country in modern history to lose all of its glaciers. The International Cryosphere Climate Initiative, ICCI, said on X that the South American nation's only remaining glacier, the Humboldt or La Corona in the Andes, had become too small to be classed as a glacier. Venezuela has lost at least 6 other glaciers in the last century. So it's more evidence that the temperatures are rising, and as a result, ice caps are melting. There hasn't been much ice on the glaciers in Venezuela since the 2000s, according to Dr. Caroline Klassen, a glaciologist at Durham University. So more evidence about climate change if it were needed.
Chain reaction.
Now, I had an interesting conversation this week with Josh Simon, and he's the Global Risk and Receivables Director for a company called JAS Worldwide. And he was telling me that he listens to news items to assess risk as one of his inputs to understand and assess global risk when it comes to establishing credit limits in particular countries and with particular companies. And you can hear that episode in full in the next couple of weeks. It will be coming your way, and I'd recommend that you stop by the Chain Reaction website and pick the episode up and have a listen to what Josh had to say. Josh is an expert in the field of credit risk, and he's been managing credit risk for both JAS in the past 3 years and, of course, for the past 30 years or more at General Electric. So you'll want to stop by and have a listen to that one. It's a great episode.
Chain reaction.
Ethiopia exported $835 million worth of coffee this year. It was about 174,596 tons of coffee in the first 9 months of the current 23-24 fiscal year. According to the Ethiopian Coffee and Tea Authority, it's one of Africa's largest producers and exporters of Arabica beans. This week there have been severe floods in southern Brazil, and it's caused 113 deaths. And it's yet another extreme event that's damaged infrastructure and is probably down to climate change, with the disappearance of the rainforests in Brazil at an alarming rate. Are we in for more of the same? A cheery little thought as we near the end of today's episode. 136 people are still missing, and more than 165,000 have been displaced from flooded homes and rescued by boats and helicopters. Access to Porto Alegre is non-existent, and looting has been reported at night. The Rio Grande do Sul will need at least 19 billion reals, £2.9 billion, to rebuild the damage, which is extended into farm areas around the capital. The fiscal impact of the floods is expected to be 7.7 billion reals, about £1.19 billion. As Britain raced to embrace service industries in line with many other economies around the globe over the last 2 to 3 decades, it forgot about some of its traditional large-scale manufacturing industries, and of course extraction industries too. There isn't really a coal industry to speak of anymore in Britain, and the steelworks, some of the last steelworks that are still open in Britain, are not owned by British Steel or any British company anymore. They're owned by Tata, which is an Indian company. And of course they've been putting pressure on the government to pass it funds to invest in the steelworks, and also they're trying to close down some of the blast furnaces in those steelworks and switching to electric for clean fuel. Now that's all very well, but it means that very soon Britain's unlikely to have any capacity to make the kind of steel it needs to protect itself, and it will be solely reliant on imports. The closure of the blast furnaces at Port Talbot in Wales are likely to see the loss of 2,800 jobs. Vaughan Gething, the Welsh Labour leader, travelled to India to Tata's headquarters in a last-ditch attempt to hold off on the closures. He's requested that Tata wait until the new incoming Labour government take power to see if a resolution can be agreed. Well, jumping the gun a little bit because we don't know if the Labour government is going to win, although it does seem very likely. This is one of the follies, of course, of giving away those industries that many regard as the commanding heights of an economy. And if you read Daniel Yergin's book called The Commanding Heights, you'll see why it's necessary for countries to place their own national interests above commercial interest. Now, there's been a revolution in the automobile industry in the past few years, and there's lots of tech equipment now attached inside vehicles. The average car has a large number of sensors inside. It's certainly over 100, and it's possibly 300. And they can generate about 25 gigabytes of data for every hour that they're on the road. Now, at one time, if any crimes were committed, investigators would come along, take fingerprints inside a car, dust for those, see what they could gather, and any other evidence that they could physically pick up inside the vehicle. But nowadays, they're much more likely to be interested in the digital data that the car has about its whereabouts, its movements, and where it's been. But there are other concerns about privacy. There's a growing concern posed by Chinese-made vehicles, EVs, which are set to dominate the European market in a few years. A former head of MI6, Sir Richard Dearlove, called for the government to consider banning Chinese EVs from sensitive UK infrastructure sites, and for every gear change and door opening to all journeys. These cars store the history of the locations where they visited, using sat-nav data and text-based messages, and any messages sent via hands-free systems. The forensic vehicle examiner is likely to be able to pick up all this data. A criminal may have wiped their phone and binned their clothes and got rid of all the physical evidence of the crime, but the car remains a data repository. And the other concern, of course, for us mere mortals, ordinary citizens, is that that data is transferred when you sell the car, if you don't wipe it clean, and it might be stored by other parties. So who gets hold of all this data? Well, there are some serious questions, and of course, it's one of the reasons when we started the episode today, we talked about Biden's increase in tariffs for Chinese cars, and this, of course, is one of the reasons. And just before we close today, a barrel of crude oil is currently selling Brent crude for about $83.37 per barrel. Well, don't forget to drop by the Chain Reaction website and pick up any episodes you've missed, and also subscribe. You'll be the first to know of new episodes when they come along. And don't forget about the great episode coming on credit risk with Josh Simon. Well, that's it for this week. Thanks for joining me here on the Chain Reaction podcast, and I hope you've enjoyed the episode. Hope you learned something. Hope you put some of the ideas that you've learned maybe into practice as you build that resilient supply chain, and you stay ahead of the game. Stay informed, get some insights, and build that competitive advantage. I'm Tony Hines, I'm signing off, and I'll see you next time in the Chain Reaction podcast. Bye for now. Hi, I'm Tony Hines. I'm here to tell you about the Chain Reaction podcast, all about supply chain advantage. I've been researching and writing about supply chains for over 25 years. I wrote my first book on supply chain strategies in the early 2000s. Each week we have special episodes on particular topics relating to supply chains, and we have a weekly news roundup every Saturday at 12 noon, all things impacting global supply chains in that week. So come and join us on the Chain Reaction podcast. I look forward to seeing you there. I'm Tony Hines. I'm signing off. Bye for now.